They had built an empire on borrowed fuel, and from the very first day of the war, Hitler knew it. Germany entered World War II with some of the most advanced tanks, aircraft, and mechanized formations on Earth, but with almost no oil of its own. The Reich produced synthetic fuel through coal hydrogenation, but even at maximum output, it could never supply the demands of the Panzerwaffe, the Luftwaffe, and the Kriegsmarine at the same time. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg revolutions, the fast-moving panzer thrusts, the deep penetrations, the mechanized encirclements, ran on gasoline and aviation fuel that Germany simply could not produce domestically. The only thing that made modern war possible for Hitler was oil from one place, Romania. And at the heart of Romania's production stood a name burned into every German strategy document from 1940 onward, Ploesti. For Hitler, Ploesti was not just another foreign asset, it was the beating heart of the German war machine. Located north of Bucharest, the Ploesti oil fields and their cluster of refineries supplied roughly one-third of all Axis oil and close to 90% of Germany's natural petroleum imports. Trains and barges carried Romanian crude across the Balkans and up the Danube, feeding German synthetic plants and fueling every major operation on the Eastern Front. Without Ploesti, the Luftwaffe could not fly, the panzers could not move, and the U-boats could not leave port. Hitler said it plainly, "If Romania falls, I lose the war." And so the story of Germany's fuel disaster begins long before the bombing raids and Soviet offensives that destroyed Ploesti. It begins with a structural weakness that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. Germany was a military superpower built atop an energy deficit. In 1941, as German armies surged into the Soviet Union, fuel shortages already haunted the logistics officers. The deeper the Wehrmacht advanced, the more trucks, tanks, and half-tracks consumed fuel at unsustainable rates. By late 1941, panzer divisions were frequently immobilized not by Soviet resistance, but by empty fuel tanks. Yet back in Berlin, Hitler and Goering reassured themselves with a simple truth: Ploesti was still pumping. As long as those oil fields remained intact, the Reich could keep fighting. That dependency only grew as the war expanded. The Afrika Korps needed fuel for its long desert supply lines. The Luftwaffe needed aviation gasoline for its fighter and bomber forces. The Kriegsmarine needed diesel for U-boats and surface raiders. Every bombing raid, every armored breakthrough, every troop movement in Hitler's empire traced its origins back to Romanian crude. And the Allies knew it. British planners had considered attacking Ploesti as early as 1940, but it was simply too far from British air bases. Only when the Americans entered the war, bringing long-range B-24 Liberators that could strike deep into Axis territory, did an attack on Romania become feasible. Meanwhile, Germany fortified Ploesti with a level of protection rivaled only by Berlin itself. The refineries and pumping stations bristled with anti-aircraft guns, more than 300 heavy and light pieces. Radar stations ringed the region. Luftwaffe fighter groups patrolled the approaches. This was not merely an industrial site, it was a fortress of strategic importance. Yet despite all this defense, by 1942, the first tremors of disaster were beginning to show in Germany's fuel calculations. Consumption was rising faster than Romania could produce, and synthetic plants struggled to make up the difference. Tank commanders on the Eastern Front rationed fuel so heavily that training exercises were drastically reduced. Luftwaffe pilots complained of shrinking flower hours. Even before the Allies struck, the German war machine was already living close to the edge, and that edge was Romania. Ploesti had become the single most important geographical point outside Germany's borders. Everything depended on it, and everyone, Hitler, the Allies, the General Staff, knew it. The coming battle for Romania would not be a sideshow. It would be the struggle for the Reich's ability to wage war at all. The loss of the oil fields would be more than a setback. It would be the slow, suffocating collapse of Germany's mechanized heart, a collapse that no battlefield victory could reverse. It was only a matter of time before that collapse began, and when it did, it would change the fate of the entire war. If Plousty was the lifeblood of Hitler's war machine, then Germany treated it exactly as such, by transforming it into one of the most heavily defended industrial sites on the planet. No other oil complex in Europe, and arguably none in the world, bristled with as much anti-aircraft firepower, camouflage, deception, and layered defensive planning. The Germans understood something fundamental. Losing Plousty meant losing the ability to wage mechanized war. And because of that, the refineries were protected with a level of intensity that made them a nightmare for Allied planners. The terrain itself favored defense. Plousty lay deep inside Axis territory, well beyond the reach of British bombers flying from the UK or Africa. Only after the United States entered the war and began operations from North Africa did the city become vulnerable. But even then, reaching it required long-range bombers traveling hundreds of miles over enemy-held territory, often without adequate fighter escort. The Germans exploited this distance mercilessly. They built a ring of radar stations around southern Romania, designed to detect incoming bombers long before they reached their targets. They emplaced hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, including the deadly 88mm batteries, around the refineries, pipeline junctions, and storage tanks. These guns formed a near-continuous belt of flak that could fill the sky with steel. The defenses did not stop with guns and radar. Plousty was surrounded by a network of deception measures, dummy tank farms, fake chimneys, false pipeline networks, and mock refinery buildings designed to confuse bombers and disrupt aiming points. German engineers altered rooftops, disguised rail lines, and constructed fake fires to mislead navigators into believing they had already hit key structures. Even the coloration of refinery equipment was adjusted to distort the outlines when seen from the air. The resulting defensive system made Plousty not just a target, it made it a death trap. Yet in 1943, the United States launched one of the most daring missions of the entire war, Operation Tidal Wave, a low-level B-24 bombing raid intended to cripple the refinery complex with a single massive strike. The operation departed from Benghazi, Libya, 1,700 miles round trip, making it one of the longest and most dangerous air missions ever attempted. The plan called for B-24s to approach Plousty at extremely low altitude, skimming the treetops to avoid radar detection, then rising only at the last moment to deliver precision hits on key refining installations. It was bold, it was innovative, and it was catastrophically costly. German and Romanian defenses responded with ferocity. Trained gunners manned anti-aircraft towers placed on refinery rooftops. Machine gun nests lined railway platforms and pipeline corridors. Smoke from burning oil tanks obscured targets. Many B-24s were shot down before reaching the refineries. Others were damaged so heavily they could not make it back to base. The 389th, 98th, and 376th bomb groups suffered losses that stunned air planners. More than 50 aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Yet for all the bravery of the American crews, the raid's results were mixed. Several refineries suffered major damage, with total operational output temporarily reduced by approximately 40%. But German engineers worked at astonishing speed. Within weeks, they restored much of the capacity. Hitler breathed a sigh of relief. Speer reported that fuel flow had resumed. The Wehrmacht scarcely felt the interruption. But in that same relief lay a fatal miscalculation. The Germans believed they had repelled the Allies' best chance to cripple Plousty. They assumed no air force could sustain repeated large-scale attacks on such a distant and heavily defended target. What they failed to anticipate was the arrival of two technologies that would change the strategic equation entirely: long-range fighter escorts and high-altitude precision bombing. In early 1944, the Allies began deploying the P-51 Mustang, a fighter capable of escorting heavy bombers all the way to Romania. At the same time, the newly strengthened 15th Air Force in Italy gained bases close enough to launch continuous high-altitude attacks from above. Plausti's defenses, optimized for low-level raids, were not designed to withstand months of sustained, escorted precision bombing from above. The fortress could bleed, and now, for the first time, the Allies had the means to strike it again and again. Operation Tidal Wave had shown the Allies one thing clearly: Plausti could be hurt. What 1944 would reveal was far more important. Plausti could be destroyed. By early 1944, the Germans still believed that Plausti, though battered, remained untouchable. Operation Tidal Wave had proven costly to the Americans, and in German eyes, confirmed the refinery complex's resilience. Anti-aircraft defenses had worked, repairs had been rapid, production had recovered. For the Reich's leadership, Plausti remained the hard, immovable pillar of their fuel supply. But that illusion would not survive the year. The strategic situation was changing, rapidly, decisively, in ways that Germany had not anticipated. The Allies were no longer launching one-off raids from distant North African bases. They now possessed a new weapon, the 15th Air Force, operating from airfields in Italy captured in late 1943. These air bases brought Plausti within regular striking distance of American heavy bombers. More importantly, the arrival of the P-51 Mustang fundamentally altered the balance of power in the skies over southeastern Europe. For the first time, U.S. bombers could fly deep into Axis territory under continuous, long-range fighter escort. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin across Italy, France, and the Eastern Front, simply could not intercept every raid. The skies that had once been safe above Romania now belonged to the Allies. On April 5, 1944, the 15th Air Force launched the first major high-altitude attack on Plausti. Dozens of refineries were struck simultaneously: Astra Romana, Columbia Aquila, Unira Speranza, Standard Petrobloc. Storage tanks erupted in flames that lit the sky for miles. The Germans managed quick repairs, but the damage took longer to fix this time. Then came April 24, a second major raid, then May 5, then May 31, then June 10, June 24, July 15, July 19, July 22, and July 28. In total, between April and August 1944, the Allies launched over 20 major bombing raids, each one more destructive than the last. The difference from 1943 was stark. This was no longer a daring gamble. It was a sustained demolition campaign backed by overwhelming industrial and air superiority. High-altitude bombing stripped away the advantages of the low-level defenses constructed after Operation Tidal Wave. Towers, smoke generators, and rooftop gun positions offered no protection against B-24s and B-17s, raining bombs from 20,000 feet. Fighter escort meant the Luftwaffe could no longer inflict prohibitive losses. Each raid degraded something Germany could not replace: refining capacity. Cracking towers, pipelines, catalytic units, distillation columns, they all required time and specialized equipment to repair. And time was something Germany no longer had. By July 1944, Plausti's refining output had fallen by 70 to 80%, according to Albert Speer's post-war testimony. Even the best German engineers could not rebuild under constant bombardment. Repairs were undone almost as soon as they were completed. Storage tanks stayed empty. Transportation networks failed. Rail lines were cratered beyond use. Romania's nearly 6,000 oil wells stood ready, but the refineries designed to turn crude into aviation gasoline and diesel fuel now lay in ruins. And then, just as the bombing reached its peak, the fatal blow came not from the air, but from the east. On August 20, 1944, the Soviet Union launched the Jassy-Kishinev offensive, one of the most devastating operations of the war. In a matter of days, the Romanian front collapsed. German forces were encircled or shattered. On August 23, King Michael of Romania staged a coup, overthrew the pro-Axis government, and announced an armistice with the Allies. Romanian troops turned their guns on their former German allies. The Wehrmacht, stunned and broken, lost its last secure land route to the Balkans, and Germany's most precious resource, its supply of natural oil, was gone forever. The shock in Berlin was immediate. Speer rushed to Hitler with fuel calculations, showing that without Romanian oil, Germany's war economy would run dry within months. Hitler refused to believe it, but the numbers did not lie. Between Allied bombing and the Soviet offensive, Germany had lost virtually 100% of its external oil supply. The Allies attempted to fall back on synthetic fuel production, but these plants, Lerna, Blechhammer, Politz, were themselves under massive bombing by the 8th Air Force. Output plunged. Aviation gasoline became so scarce that Luftwaffe training flights were curtailed to minutes per pilot. Panzer divisions were allocated a fraction of their previous rations. Truck convoys stalled. The mechanized corps of the Wehrmacht, built so confidently on blitzkrieg doctrine, had been reduced to a fuel-starved shell. In just 4 months, the Allies had accomplished what years of fighting on the Eastern Front had not. They had crippled Germany's ability to wage modern war. Ploesti had not merely been damaged, it had been erased from Germany's war plan, and with it went Hitler's last hope of reversing the tide. By late 1944, the German army still fielded some of the most formidable armored vehicles in the world: Tiger I, Tiger II, Panther, Stug III, Jagdpanther. In design and firepower, many of these machines remained unmatched on the battlefield. A Panther's high-velocity 75mm gun could destroy a Sherman at over a kilometer. A Tiger's frontal armor was nearly impervious to Allied weapons at normal combat ranges. But none of it mattered anymore. The German armored corps did not collapse because it was outgunned or outbuilt. It collapsed because its engines went silent. The catastrophe that followed the loss of Romanian oil was not theoretical. It was visible, tangible, and immediate. Across Europe, on the Eastern Front, in Italy, in the West, German roadsides filled with abandoned armored vehicles. Some were damaged. Many were in perfect mechanical condition. Nearly all were useless. The tanks simply had no fuel, and without fuel, the Panzerwaffe ceased to exist as a strategic force. The numbers alone show the scale of the disaster. A Tiger I consumed roughly 500 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers. A Panther required nearly 300 liters per 100 kilometers. Even a relatively economical Panzer IV burned far more than Germany could now supply. Before the loss of Romanian oil, Germany could at least allocate fuel to active fronts, even if it meant cutting back on training. After August 1944, there was nothing to allocate. Hitler's armies were fighting with the war's most fuel-hungry machines at the exact moment their fuel supply collapsed to a trickle. On the Eastern Front, German armored counterattacks became nearly impossible. Army Group North Ukraine, Army Group South, and the remnants of Army Group Center found themselves unable to maneuver. Soviet breakthroughs that might once have been met by fast-moving panzer reserves now unfolded uncontested because the tanks assigned to counterattack could not even start their engines. During the Soviet advance through Poland and into East Prussia, German panzer divisions often received fuel rations so small that commanding officers had to choose which handful of tanks would operate that day. Others were left camouflaged at the rear, waiting for fuel that would never arrive. Even more crippling was the collapse of training. Before the fuel crisis, panzer crews trained extensively in gunnery, maneuver, turret coordination, and engine management. Now, new crews often entered combat having fired only a few practice rounds or none at all. A Tiger or Panther was a highly technical vehicle, requiring expert handling. Without training, inexperienced crews wasted ammunition, overstrained engines, exposed their flanks, or misjudged distances in combat. The Luftwaffe suffered an even more dramatic collapse. Aviation fuel became so scarce that Germany grounded most of its pilot training programs. New pilots sometimes entered combat with fewer than 20 hours of flight time, a fraction of what Allied pilots received. Meanwhile, experienced Luftwaffe veterans, who might have slowed the Allied bombing campaign, were grounded simply because their airfields no longer had gasoline. Many fighter units in late 1944 recorded days where more than half their aircraft were operational, but none could take off. Even the elite Jagdgeschwader 52 on the Eastern Front, home to aces like Erich Hartmann, flew fewer sorties with each passing month. The Air Force of 1940, the one that had terrorized Europe, was gone in all but name. On the Western Front, the fuel disaster shaped every German decision. During the Normandy campaign, panzer divisions that might have counterattacked the Allies more aggressively were hampered by shortages. Near Caen, the powerful Panzer Lehr division struggled to redeploy because its trucks and half-tracks had no gasoline. In the retreat from France, countless armored vehicles were abandoned intact simply because they could not be driven to safety. By the winter of 1944, the crisis reached a level that bordered on the absurd. To launch the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler had to strip fuel from every other front in Europe, even from training schools, reserve depots, and Luftwaffe units. The entire offensive, designed to split the Allied armies, depended on capturing American fuel dumps along the way. If they failed to capture those dumps, the tanks would stop. That is exactly what happened. By late December, German armored spearheads like Kampfgruppe Peiper were surrounded not because they were destroyed, but because they ran out of gasoline. Their tanks, including precious Panthers, had to be abandoned in forests and villages across Belgium. The dream of a renewed German offensive died on empty fuel tanks. The Eastern Front soon followed. When the Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945, German mechanized forces barely moved. Entire panzer divisions fought as static infantry units. Horse-drawn wagons replaced trucks. Fuel reserves at some depots were so low that German reports classified them as not measurable. What remained of Germany's once mighty armored force was reduced to fragments, brilliant machines trapped in a war they could no longer move through. The Panzerwaffe did not die in a battlefield duel. It died when its fuel stopped flowing. And when the tanks stopped, so did Hitler's war. By the end of 1944, Germany's defeat was no longer a question of battlefield tactics or operational maneuver. It was a matter of physics. Modern war ran on fuel, and Germany no longer had any. The destruction of Ploiesti's refineries, the severing of Romanian oil shipments, and the relentless Allied bombing of synthetic fuel plants inside the Reich had pushed Hitler's war machine into its final, irreversible decline. What followed was not the typical collapse of a losing army, but the systemic shutdown of an entire mechanized civilization. The German High Command understood almost immediately what the loss of Romanian oil meant. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, warned Hitler that without Ploiesti, the Reich's remaining fuel production would fall below the minimum threshold required to sustain military operations. That threshold was not theoretical. Germany needed roughly 300,000 tons of fuel per month just to keep its armies, Air Force, and Navy minimally functional. After August 1944, total production fell to less than 10,000 tons in some months, and often lower. Even this tiny amount was unreliable because the Allies were simultaneously dismantling Germany's synthetic fuel facilities. Plants at Leuna, Bleckhammer, Perlitz, and Brooks, which had once produced aviation gasoline and diesel from coal hydrogenation, were pounded by the 8th Air Force until they lay in ruins. By early 1945, synthetic production was operating at less than 5% of pre-war output. Germany had become a state without fuel. Strategic paralysis followed. The Luftwaffe, once the centerpiece of Blitzkrieg, ceased to exist as a meaningful combat force. It still had aircraft, thousands of them, but almost none could fly. Fuel for training evaporated, instructors were grounded, flight schools closed. The elite pilot force that had dominated European skies in 1939 to 41 dwindled into scattered pockets of undertrained replacements. Even the introduction of advanced fighters like the Me-262 jet could not reverse the decline, because the jets required vast quantities of aviation fuel just to operate. As a result, they flew only a fraction of the missions they were capable of. The Kriegsmarine fared no better. U-boat operations collapsed because submarines could not refuel at sea. Surface ships remained in port, their fuel tanks dry. Even the mighty battleship Tirpitz, already damaged, became nothing more than a stationary target before her final sinking. The Wehrmacht, the heart of the German war effort, suffered the most agonizing decline. Mobility vanished. Entire divisions lost the ability to redeploy, counterattack, or even retreat. Elite formations like the Großdeutschland Division, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, and Panzerlehr were reduced to scattered infantry groups clutching Panzerfausts because their armored vehicles could not move. Strategic reserves, the core of Blitzkrieg doctrine, no longer existed. Hitler could issue orders, but his armies could not execute them. At the operational level, this paralysis decided every major campaign from late 1944 onward. During the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945, the Red Army advanced hundreds of kilometers in weeks because the German forces simply could not maneuver. Panzer divisions that might once have blunted Soviet breakthroughs were stuck in place, their tanks immobile. In Hungary, during the final battles around Lake Balaton, Hitler committed his last reserve of armored forces in a futile attempt to recapture oil fields near Nagy Kanizsa, the Reich's final trickle of natural fuel. It was a desperate, symbolic gesture. Without oil, even victory in Hungary would have changed nothing. In the West, the Ardennes offensive revealed the extent of the crisis. Hitler's grand counterattack relied explicitly on capturing American fuel dumps. Plans assumed the seizure of tens of thousands of gallons to keep the offensive moving. When Kampfgruppe Peiper failed to secure those stocks, his panzers and the offensive ground to a halt. Germany had mounted a last gamble for victory, fueled not by its own reserves, but by the hope of stealing Allied gasoline. Nothing illustrated the collapse more starkly than the everyday reality of German soldiers in 1945. Truck convoys were replaced by horse-drawn wagons, the same logistics method used in World War I. Armored battalions dug in their tanks like turrets, using them as static defenses because they could not be driven into battle. Infantry divisions marched on foot through mud and snow because their few remaining vehicles were needed to move ammunition and medical supplies. The Third Reich had entered the war with some of the most advanced mechanized forces in the world. It ended the war fighting largely with horses. Strategically, Hitler's defeat was sealed the moment Romania fell and Ploiesti's wells stopped pumping oil to the Reich. Without oil, Germany could no longer fight a war of movement. Without movement, it could no longer wage blitzkrieg. And without blitzkrieg, the military machine that had conquered half of Europe became nothing more than a vast, immobile target for the Red Army and the Western Allies. The loss of oil did not merely weaken Germany, it made continued resistance impossible. It turned armored divisions into infantry, aircraft into grounded wrecks, and grand strategies into empty fantasies. In the end, Hitler did not just lose the war on the battlefield, he lost it in the fuel tanks that ran dry, in the refineries destroyed beyond repair, and in the oil fields of Romania that slipped from his grasp forever.